Hi everyone, welcome back to our mini lectures for History 1305 or U.S. history. This week what we're talking about generally is the issue of westward expansion. And we're going to take this opportunity to backtrack a little bit. In the week that we lost, week 10, we were looking at some events in the early 1800s, and many of those are particularly relevant to the issue of westward expansion. So just make sure you go and look at the updated PowerPoint because I've added a little bit of content to that just to help us get the big picture of what's going on with this issue of westward expansion in the 19th century. And the reason that this is such an important subject is because oftentimes we think of this 19th century in America as being a time period that was dominated by these discussions of slavery and abolition. And really, when you stop and look at what's driving people towards these arguments, and this is something you'll definitely want to be addressing in the introduction of your signature assignment, the big issue is not necessarily slavery where it exists, but slavery as the country continues moving westward. It's about slavery in the territories that the United States is acquiring, and the fact that the existing territories and states are already arguing about the issue. So it's very difficult to decide what's going to happen in these newer westward territories of the United States. So it definitely is going to have a big impact on the events building up to the Civil War. But there are a number of key events that we're going to be focusing on today. We'll sort of be talking about slavery in relation to them, particularly the annexation of Texas. But really, what we're going to be looking at is just the key events that drove Americans westward. And so the first one that we're going to be talking about is the Louisiana Purchase. It pretty much doubles the existing territory in the United States. Almost the entire middle third of the continental U.S. will be added in the Louisiana Purchase. That's happening in 1803. And it's really what starts to push Americans past the boundaries of the Mississippi River. Shortly thereafter, we're going to briefly look at Lewis and Clark's expedition to the West Coast. They're considered the first Americans to chart a path to the West Coast. They're going to be leaving from just east of the Mississippi in St. Louis, and they're going to be pushing all the way to the west. You're pretty much taking a northerly pass through the Rockies until they get out to the West Coast. But thinking of them as the first Americans who make it out to the westward coast, is not necessarily an accurate view. We're going to be taking a look at a lot of the people who are contributing to that, many of them being Native Americans who were already familiar with the territory. And then after that, we're going to look at the establishment of the Oregon Trail in the early 18 teens, like 1811, and that's going to be a popular path to get out west until about the 1840s. And you know, it's more than just a video game. It's sort of the path, and probably a video game you're all unfamiliar with. It's more from my childhood. But that's the path that people are going to be taking out to the westward areas, basically to Oregon Territory, which is the Pacific Northwest. Then we're going to be looking at something probably that a lot of you are already very familiar with, the annexation of Texas and the Texas Revolution. Then we're going to look at the cession of Oregon Territory. That's happening in 1846. It's an event where the British will be handing over what at the time is disputed territory. Up in the Pacific Northwest, they give the United States Oregon Territory. And that will help to form our modern day boundaries between the Pacific Northwest and the United States, like Washington State, Oregon, Northern California, and the southern boundary line of what today we call Canada. After that, we'll be looking at the Mexican-American War. This is a major event in westward expansion in the 19th century. It's occurring from 1846 to 1848. In a bit of a spoiler alert, the United States is going to come out victorious in this war, and that's going to force the newly independent Mexican government to cede a lot of what today we call the American Southwest over to the United States. So there the U.S. is picking up areas like Southern California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, these types of territories. And then we're going to wrap up this week's discussion with the major event of the mid-19th century, that is the California Gold Rush. And we're not going to look at the entirety of the gold rush, but basically the events between 1848 and 1850. What this is going to do is put some major pressure on the United States government because California is going to very quickly get enough people to declare statehood, and they are going to demand to enter the Union as a free state. And this will force something known as the Compromise of 1850. So those are the major events we're going to be talking about today. In the rest of this mini lecture, I'm going to be touching on both the Louisiana Purchase and Lewis and Clark's expedition to the West Coast. Then we'll wrap up this video, and with the next lecture, we'll start picking up the other events that are dealing with westward expansion. So the first notion that we even need to deal with before we start looking at this idea of the Louisiana Purchase, at this particular event that's happening in 1803, it's this concept known as manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is the idea that is pervasive amongst a number of Americans all throughout the 19th century. It even begins before that, in the late 1700s. But what manifest destiny represents, it's an idea. It's not an actual event itself. It's simply a concept. But it's the idea that white Americans are ordained by God to take the entire continental United States from the East Coast to the West Coast. And so this is really an idea that is driving this notion and justifying westward expansion, because we know that westward expansion is going to be coming at the expense of Native Americans living in the Great Plains and in the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest. And so all those groups that we were talking about at the beginning of the semester when we were looking at the Americas prior to European arrival, the ones living in the West, they're really going to be impacted by this. And America's policy up to this point has been to just push the Native Americans west, push them west, push them west. But when Americans start to think that we own everything from the East Coast to the West Coast, you don't have anywhere else to push them. And so that's ultimately going to be what starts to result in the process of moving Native Americans onto small reservations around the nation. And so really, they're the ones who are kind of paying the price of this idea of manifest destiny. And so this is a very important concept that you need to understand, because manifest destiny is really this idea that's driving Americans. If you were to ask an American in the mid-19th century, why is it okay to kick all these people off their land and continue moving westward all the way to the coast? The answer would be, that's manifest destiny. God has told us that it's our job as white Americans to push everyone else out of the way and to, what they would say, is civilize the entire continental United States. And so this does tie in a little bit to the issue of slavery. Again, going back to that idea that westward expansion in general is going to push the issue of slavery to the forefront of Americans' minds. It's what really causes them to argue over this issue of slavery. When we look at what's happening with manifest destiny, I always zero in on this idea that it's about white Americans spreading from coast to coast. Because after Gabriel's Rebellion, one of the last events we looked at before we went to spring break and some of the madness occurred, what happened there is, after Gabriel's Rebellion, a number of Virginia planters, the cotton gin had not yet really become prominent in American society. It hadn't made slavery that profitable. And so the Virginia planters are really fearful of slave rebellion. They don't want to have this issue where their slaves rise up, murder them and their families. And so they really start to seriously consider the idea of emancipation and abolition of the institution of slavery. And they think the westward territories, that's a good place to remove African Americans from American society, give them their own land out west. But Jefferson, who's president at the time that this occurs, Jefferson steps forward and says, we're not going to do that. That land is for white Americans to spread from coast to coast. We're not going to give a large parcel of it over to black Americans who had recently been released from slavery. And so that also will kind of contribute to this idea of tabling emancipation for a few years, pushing that argument down the line, and then all of a sudden we see the invention of the cotton gin, and there's no way that the American South is going to be getting rid of slavery at that time. So if you're following along on the slideshow, you can see on the map there what the Louisiana Purchase is all about. The big orange section in the map that I put up for you represents all of the territory that will be acquired from France as part of the Louisiana Purchase. This is a really major event that happens in 1803. And the territory that the United States is going to acquire is huge. It's all the way from New Orleans in Louisiana, going up the westward side of the Mississippi River, and then stretching all the way out through the Great Plains. They're picking up areas like Oklahoma, Kansas, what today we would call, basically the Dakotas and Montana, Nebraska. All of these territories are going to get rolled into the United States as part of the Louisiana Purchase. So, for a little background on this event, at 1800, the French would be given back control of the Mississippi River Valley and Louisiana Territory from the Spanish. Napoleon is kind of marching through Europe, and this is one of the concessions that Spain will make to him, is they say, look, we'll give you back that territory you used to own in the Americas. As soon as Napoleon gets control and France gets control of Louisiana Territory, they shut down trade to the United States in New Orleans. This is a critically important port to the United States economically. They need to do business there in New Orleans. And so Napoleon comes in and says, that's it. No more American business is happening here. Some people in Congress are getting ready to go to war with France. They're looking to say, hey, Napoleon's busy in Europe. We'll just take this area back from them by war. But Jefferson doesn't want to do that. As we've talked about in the past, he's what you call a Francophile. He's very, very keen on France, on French culture, and he does not want to go to war with Napoleon or France. And so he sends some envoys over to France to talk to the French government under Napoleon. And really all they're looking to do is buy New Orleans. They want to purchase New Orleans from the French so that we can continue to use that as a major port of operation in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, when the envoys go over there, Napoleon turns around and says, you want to buy New Orleans? Hell, I'll sell you all of Louisiana territory. You can have the whole thing. And so this is really shocking to the American government, and they're forced to make a pretty quick reaction to this. But there's a problem for Jefferson. Remember that Jefferson is this guy who says, if the Constitution doesn't give the federal government the right to do it, then the federal government can't do it. And there's nothing in the American Constitution about purchasing land from a foreign government. And so Jefferson's going to have to go against his own Republican ideals here, the Democratic Republican ideals of strict construction, and he's going to use federal money to secure the Louisiana Purchase from France. Now, it cost the United States about 15 million francs at the time, and they also forgive a large, large debt that the French owe to the United States at this point. But what it will do is double the amount of land that the United States holds, and it gives the United States full control of the Mississippi River Valley. And this will, as I mentioned in last lecture when we were looking at, sort of the long 19th century and industrialization and the change in the American economy, having access to that riverway is huge. With steam engine boats, you can now basically traverse the entire country north to south on the Mississippi River. So the Louisiana Purchase is a major event in American history, and without it, the entire middle third of the country would not have belonged to the United States. So that brings us to our next issue that we're going to deal with, and really the last issue we're going to deal with in this little mini lecture video, and that is the expedition of Lewis and Clark in 1804. And you should be able to see some pattern of cause and effect here, right? So we've got 1803, America acquires all this new land to the west. 1804, Lewis and Clark start trying to chart and map this land out in the Westward Territory. Again, if you're following along with the PowerPoint lecture, you'll see a map that shows the route that they took out to the Westward Territory. And then the next image you'll see there is a picture of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. So you don't need to know too much about that particular voyage or that expedition. It's just kind of important to know that those two are the ones who are sort of most credited with charting that path out to the west. But really what's important, and what I want to point out about this, is that Lewis and Clark could not have mapped this entire trek out without the help of Native Americans. It also should be said here at this point that a lot of their traveling crew are enslaved African Americans. They're the ones doing a lot of the heavy lifting and legwork to move. They're having to go on the river. They're basically pushing up the Missouri River and then moving out west that way. But there's areas where they have to get out and portage their boats. They have to actually start cutting away forest and drag their canoes and their boats out of the river and overland. And so it's largely going to be slave labor and also free white labor as well. But there's a lot of laborers, and they're not just white Americans who are helping track this course out and forge that path to the West. And in addition to that, Native Americans are a key part of this journey. You're probably at least marginally familiar with a woman named Sacagawea. Sacagawea is a Native American from right around the modern day borders of North and South Dakota. She is multilingual. She had been forced to leave her own tribe, had married into another tribe, and then left her husband and joined a different tribe out in the West. But she's multilingual. She speaks a lot of the languages that Lewis and Clark are going to be encountering as they're moving west. And so what she's really able to do is function as an interpreter and really a guide. She's the person guiding Lewis and Clark out west. She personally doesn't know the best route to take out west, but she can talk to the Native Americans who do know, the ones living in those areas. When they get up to the Rocky Mountains, she's going to talk to local Native Americans and say, how do we not get stuck up in the mountains and die in the middle of the winter? Because that's what happens when you get stuck in those mountains over wintertime. And so, ultimately, she is critical, and without her indigenous knowledge, she's also a bit of a botanist and an animal expert. Lewis and Clark, their journey is marginally important for showing that there is a pathward to get out west. What they're really credited with doing over the long haul, because there were French people, Russians, there were a lot of different Europeans who had sort of understood the westward territories and knew the best way to move around it. What Lewis and Clark are really credited for in modern times is they documented a lot of the plant life and animal life out there. But again, it's Sacagawea who understood the differences between these species, the uses of different medicinal plants. And so really a lot of what we give credit to Meriwether Lewis and William Clark for is something that we ought to be giving credit to Sacagawea and her indigenous knowledge of these territories. That's really a critical part of that journey. So that's really all you need to know about Lewis and Clark's expedition out west. It happened in 1804. They're credited as being the first Americans to find the path westward, but it's largely indigenous knowledge that's going to be pushing them all the way out to the west. And this is a nice segue into our just what I want to wrap up this video lecture with. We're talking about westward expansion this week, and that really needs to sort of tie into the people who are already living in that territory, and those are Native Americans. Jefferson's view of Native Americans in the early 19th century is that it's a long tradition of viewing people from outside of Europe, something they call the noble savage. Jefferson basically has this view of Native Americans that they're simple, they're kind of backwards, they're not as sophisticated or civilized as Europeans, but there's goodness within that simplicity. They haven't been corrupted, they haven't been driven by greed. He has this very rosy view of Native Americans, that they live in this very egalitarian, let's all sing Kumbaya around the campfire kind of society. And so that's his way of sort of looking at him. He sees them as free of desire and materialism. And because of that, he favors a process known as assimilation. This is going to be something that Native Americans are trying to cope with during the long 19th century. Assimilation is basically the idea that there's so few Native Americans left that if we teach them to talk like white Americans, teach them to worship like white Americans, teach them to dress like white Americans, to think like white Americans, then ultimately we can just breed with them and breed them out of existence. That they'll just blend into the white population and Native Americans will cease to exist. Therefore, you no longer have a Native American problem in the West as the American government sees it. Not all of the Native Americans are going to basically buy into this. A lot of Native Americans do tend to assimilate into white culture. That's why you have a lot of what looks to be Caucasian Americans walking around today saying, I'm 1/16th Cherokee or I'm 1/24th Lakota. And so what we're seeing there is that a lot of Native Americans do follow this process. They learn English, they convert to Christianity, they get rid of their traditional dress and languages and culture, and they just start blending into white society. However, there are a number of other Native Americans, mostly religious leaders. They see that their role within society is now under threat. And so they start to lead what are known as Native American revivals. They say that they're inspired by religious visions, and they are calling for a total return to Native American customs and ideals under these visions. There's a particularly important one in the early 1800s. This is Tenskwatawa's movement. He is a Lenape person in basically what then is Ohio. And so he's in Ohio and he's saying we need to reject white culture. We need to just totally push these white people out of our minds, don't do what they say, don't deal with them, don't do business with them, and they reject white culture in its entirety. Tenskwatawa's movement is going to blend into a more armed resistance that happens during the War of 1812, and this is known as Tecumseh's War or Tecumseh's Rebellion. Tecumseh is going to be leading this armed resistance to westward expansion, and he's getting support from the British in the midst of the War of 1812. They're giving him weapons, they're giving him money, and so he's leading this resistance. The resistance doesn't really, he's in the Ohio Territory, southern Michigan, Indiana, basically all the places we saw the Northwest Indian War was being fought. So he pushes this sort of revivalist. He picks up on his brother's idea of a religious revival and a cultural revival, and he pushes this into outright warfare when the Americans are going to war with the British in the War of 1812. And so you can see that Native Americans are not taking this process of assimilation or westward expansion lying down. They are pushing back against it, but unfortunately, in the long run, as most of you are probably aware, their numbers are too few and they're not going to be able to resist this process of westward expansion in the long haul. You're going to see a number of other wars happening in the Plains states, what they often call the Plains Wars, appropriately named. And there also is going to be a good deal of conflict out west, like with the Nez Perce people in the Northwest Territories. Shouldn't say Northwest Territories, and what today we call the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington State, and Northern California. But again, it's just important to understand that despite the fact that they are really getting a lot of pressure put on their communities during this process, Native Americans are not just rolling over and accepting it. Some are choosing this process of assimilation, others are choosing to fight against American expansion to the West. Well, that wraps up this particular mini lecture video, and we will address the rest of westward expansion in the following videos ahead. All right, in this particular mini lecture video, we're going to be dealing with a few key events, and we're going to be covering a long period of time here, or rather, more accurately, we're going to start early and can kind of jump to the mid-century. We're going to be dealing with both the Oregon Trail and the emergence of the Oregon Trail, which is how most people are going to be moving out westward between about 1810 and 1840, just rough ballpark dates. And then we will move on to a discussion of the Texas Revolution, which is necessarily rooted in the very recently occurred Mexican independence movement when they break away from the Empire of Spain. And so those are the two key subjects to focus in on. We're following right along with the slideshow for this week. And so that's where we're at here. So if you start looking at the maps that introduce the Oregon Trail to you, this is showing you the route that most of the travelers moving from the east to the west would be taking. And what you should be seeing when you're looking at this map is you're seeing this sort of clean line moving on a northerly route through the Plains states and out through the Rockies to the west coast. This is a roughly 2,000 plus mile trip. It's really, really arduous. And what people are doing, you can see on both maps there that one's kind of showing you, the one on the left shows you the freeways and stuff in modern times, kind of gives you an idea of the states that this moves through. It starts out in an area called Independence, Missouri, and then it moves through Nebraska, Wyoming, Idaho, and eventually out to what at that time is called Oregon Territory, and what today we call Oregon, and Oregon City in particular is the area on the Pacific coast that most people are moving to. But there's a few areas where people are stopping off along the way. They are taking advantage of some U.S. military forts that are being erected in this territory. They're generally using those to resupply, to do business with Native Americans, and to oftentimes get protection from hostile Native Americans that are attacking the wagon trains. This becomes a constant source of conflict between Native Americans in the West and the United States government. The government's response is generally to use more U.S. military presence out west to engage in armed conflict and stop these Native American raids on the wagon trains that are moving out west. But what I want you to take notice of with this map is when we're looking at this, it's a fairly straight shot. People are moving through the quickest route possible to get from the Mississippi River out to the west coast. There's very little that's being done in between. People are not stopping and settling in Casper, Wyoming. They're not stopping in Omaha, Nebraska. They're not stopping in large numbers in Boise, Idaho. They're generally making a straight shot to the Pacific coast. They're not stopping and settling the middle areas along the way. This is going to have an impact a little bit later on in U.S. history when we come back to that issue of westward expansion and how this all ties into slavery. Moving forward through our slideshow, you can see the wagon trains that are moving out west. This would be the preferred method of moving. And what you'll generally see is you look at the wagon train and you might notice that you've got horses or oxes, depending on what sort of livestock you had with you. They would be pulling the actual wagons, and oftentimes people would be walking right alongside these wagons. If you're anything like me, you might be looking at this and wondering, why are you bothering with a wagon if you're just going to walk alongside what's being pulled by the horses or the oxen? And the truth of the matter is those wagons represent something. Inside of those covered wagons is basically everything a human being owned. Everything an American person had in their lives would be packed into these wagons and moved out west along with them. What this tells you is they're not coming back. Their goal is to move and make a new life for themselves. These are truly migrant people. They're moving from the east of the United States into the uncharted and unknown west. And they're taking a really huge risk when they do this. They're really putting their lives on the line. If something goes wrong along the way, you could easily die on this trip. Disease is pretty rampant on the Oregon Trail. Dysentery, malnourishment, lack of clean drinking water. These are all major problems. In addition to that, you have to cross the very, very treacherous Rocky Mountains. And if you get stuck in the Rocky Mountains at the wrong time, you take a wrong turn and get lost up there, you are in serious trouble. And this sort of reminds me of an event in the 1800s known as the Donner Party. If you're unfamiliar with this event, it's not something you'll be tested on, but it sort of highlights this idea of the danger incumbent on this journey. The Donner Party was a group of migrants moving out west along the Oregon trails, and they got caught in the mountains in the west. They tried to get through them before winter came, but they got trapped up there when early snows came, and they were stuck in the mountains. Their conditions were such that they got so desperate that they ended up eating one another. Whoever died first was seen as a source of food rather than a compatriot with which you were traveling. And so this shows you the severity of what's really going on with this trip. This is not an easy breezy jump in the car and cruise Route 66 out to the west coast. These people are putting their lives on the line, and they're making this trek because they hope there is a better economic opportunity in the west than there was where they're coming from in the east. Definitionally, the Oregon Trail is the route that's used by American migrants to move to the west coast, or at that time, like I said, they're really moving into what we today call Oregon, and at that time was generally called Oregon Territory. It's a 2,000 plus mile long journey that they're taking here, and it was earlier established. The idea of taking this route, they're not following the exact same path that Lewis and Clark took out west. It's very similar. They're not too far off that path, but it's actually a route that was established by earlier Americans who settled out there before America even owned the territory. Fur traders mostly, and what they called mountain men. As you can see, it's bolded out in one of our key terms, likely to show up on an exam. Those guys were already out there. They were exploring the territory for business opportunities. They started to establish this trail out at 1811. That's really when we start to see people moving along this particular route. Other Americans trying to get out to the territory beforehand tried to take different routes. And even in the early years of the formation of the Oregon Trail, a lot of people were not even convinced this was the best path. But the mountain men were American citizens who had moved out west already, a lot of them as early as the late 18th century. Others came later in the early 19th century. But they were trading for fur with Native Americans in these sort of festivals known as fur trade rendezvous. These were kind of important intercultural mixing points, these rendezvous. because what they were all about is basically you'd be out hunting, trapping, doing what you've got to do to collect the furs, and then you would bring it all to a central point where people would exchange things for money, exchange things for other good, barter style trade. But what it meant is when everybody came to these rendezvous, this represented the culmination of all their hard work. And so they were ready to let off some steam and party. There's a lot of drinking, a lot of gambling, a lot of intercultural relationships. Basically, there's a lot of mountain men having sex with Native American women. You're seeing a lot of mixing in these areas, and you're also seeing a lot of contentious issues at these fur trade rendezvous as well. People feeling they've been cheated, people losing a lot of money gambling. They'd start to get into fights, things like that. There were kind of some unruly parties up in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. But it's these mountain men who are engaging in these fur trade rendezvous. They too, just like Lewis and Clark before them, they're relying on local knowledge, on indigenous knowledge of this area to make a living for themselves. And it's on the back of what they know that Americans are going to start forging the Oregon Trail. Movement along this trail is pretty sluggish in the early 19th century. And I can see that there's a typo there in our PowerPoint presentation. Make sure you correct that to early 19th century. But this will always remain the favored route along which people are going to be moving to the west. They generally take this more northerly route, but that's because Americans at this point don't really understand the geography of the United States or the terrain of the United States. What they're dealing with here is that a map published by a guy named Stephen Long in 1823, he comes along and he labels everything south of basically Omaha, Nebraska, as being a giant dead arid desert. So he mislabels places like Kansas, like Oklahoma, as being nothing but desert land. He calls it the Great American Desert. Because of this, nobody wants to take a southerly route out west. That's why the Oregon Trail becomes really popular. One last aspect that I want to point out about the Oregon Trail, and what's really kind of critical about this, is that a lot of the migrants moving here are women, and they're not necessarily moving willingly. Their men are the ones who want to go seek this economic opportunity out west, and they drag the women and children along with them. And the reason that women don't really want to take this trek is because, in addition to all of the familial duties that they already have, cooking, cleaning, rearing the children, taking care of the campsite that you're setting up every time you stop, they're also having to take on more what we would consider to be masculine roles. They're having to chop firewood, hunt for animals. So their workload is doubling. And many of these women are being dragged along it by their husbands saying, I really don't want to do this. And what do you think is out west that's so much better than what we have back east? But it's important to remember the sort of gendered and sex diversity of the people and age diversity as well. Kids are being dragged along this trail. And you're seeing high rates of mortality because people don't have access to clean water, medicine, all of these types of things as they're moving along that trail. So that wraps up our discussion of the Oregon Trail, and we can move to something that, again, most of you are probably largely familiar with, and that is the Texas Revolution and America's eventual annexation of Texas in 1845. But in order to get our heads wrapped around what's happening with Texas independence, we need to understand Mexican independence first. We need to look at events that are playing out between 1821 and 1825. At the beginning of the 19th century, in the early 1800s, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, California, Southern California anyway, they are all a part of Spain's territorial holdings. And then that also includes the areas, if you keep going south, like Mexico, El Salvador, these types of places as well. It all belongs to Spain. There's no such nation as Mexico. Mexico's not independent at that time. The Spanish government will be settling in these forts a lot of times for our concerns in U.S. history. They're largely setting them up in Southern California. They're setting up missions to convert Native Americans, and they're setting up forts to try to bring Native Americans in. They're basically using Native Americans as slave labor. They're using them in a forced labor system known as the encomienda system. And they're saying it's for the good of the Native Americans because ultimately They should be working on our colonial projects, but they should also be getting enlightened about Catholicism, Christianity, and be converting as well. So, in 1821, there's a major shift occurring. Mexico, a lot like the United States had a little bit earlier in history, decided we don't want to be ruled by some monarch across the Atlantic Ocean in Spain. We should be running our own affairs here in Mexico. And so they declared independence from Spain, and they are successful in that independence movement. And they start to reorganize their society. They release Native Americans from this forced labor systems, and they abandon the mission system. In place of that, Mexican governments start giving out huge tracts of land to their citizens. Now, to be clear, we're talking about their citizens who have some European descent, some European bloodline, people of Spanish origin. They're giving these lands out to wealthy families, and then they would employ Native Americans at a very, very small fee. And so they would be now technically paying the Native Americans to work, but not a lot. And it's not a whole lot different than the system that was happening underneath the Spanish colonial government. Now, the Mexican government's got an issue in the area that we're all in right now, what we call Texas today. You have the Comanches and the Apaches are a rather warlike and skilled sort of warrior culture that are living in this territory. And there are very few people of European descent under the Mexican government living in this area. And so, to rectify this problem, they're saying we want more white people in this area to outnumber the Native Americans, to drive out these Apaches and these Comanches. And so, in order to do that, they invite white Americans to start moving into Mexico and settling, or moving into what today we call Texas and settling there. So they put a few conditions on this process. They said, we're willing to let you in so long as you convert to Catholicism and you learn to speak Spanish. These are the rules that they place on these new American Texans that start moving in. By 1830, the American Texans had come to outnumber, and when we say American Texans, we're talking about white American, English-speaking Americans who moved into the area that is today Texas when they were invited by the Mexican government. They start to outnumber the Tejanos living in the region by about 7,000 to 4,000 by 1830. So you can see that they're moving in really, really heavy numbers. Now, they established this really key pattern of trade between Santa Fe, New Mexico, which still belongs to the Mexican government, and Missouri. And this was a huge source of wealth to the Mexican government, one that they didn't really want to give up. But it's something that they're going to have to deal with because the American Texans who are moving in are not readily playing ball. They're not playing by the rules. So we're moving on to the next slide now that's talking about the Texas Revolution between 1835 and 1837. Despite the fact that Mexico is making huge money off of their profitable trade with the United States, they have three major problems with the new Texans. One, the Texans moving in, they're not coming in and learning Spanish. They're staying in American communities and they're speaking English. Number two, they are bringing thousands and thousands of slaves with them. Because if you think about it, when Mexico opens the borders and says, hey, Americans, you can move on in. We need more European people down here. More Caucasian people, we should say, to be more accurate. People from Michigan are not rushing to move down to Mexico. People from Ohio or New York or Boston, they're not going down to Mexico. It's basically people from Louisiana territory, from Mississippi, from Alabama, from Florida, slave-owning territories. So when they move in, they bring thousands of slaves with them. They bring a slave economy into Texas. And Mexico is trying to work towards abolition. They don't want slavery in their society. So that's another problem that they have with the new Texans that are moving in. In addition to that, they're not going to be converting to Catholicism very readily either. They refuse to take on that new religion. And then finally, the Americans are very vocal and very open about the fact that they're going to take control of this territory anyway, that this is going to eventually become independent or American, that the Mexican government and their rules and their laws really don't matter to these new Texans. So this is a huge problem for the Mexican government. There's a small uprising amongst these new Texans in 1826 that would just be immediately crushed by the Mexican government. And after that event, the Mexican government says no more Americans are allowed into Mexico. They completely closed the border and said no more American immigration. They're not allowed into Mexico. And this is what's happening between 1826 and 1833. They totally stop American movement into the territory. And they do this at their own expense. They're hurting economically because they need American trade. But by shunning the Americans from and stopping them from moving in any great numbers, that trade is devastated. Now, they are forced, because of that situation, by 1835 to reopen the borders to Texas. Or in 1833, they reopen the borders of Texas. They allow Americans to come in. And by 1835, there's 30,000 Americans living in what today we call Texas. So, General Santa Anna the Mexican government is having some growing pains early on. And a military commander by the name of Santa Anna would overthrow the Mexican government in the 1830s, the early to mid 1830s. And so, as soon as this happens in 1835, when Santa Anna takes full control of the Mexican government, the American Texans see it as an opportunity, and they declare their own independence in the region, and they draft up a constitution to make Texas an independent nation. Now, Santa Anna is not going to take this lying down. He sends his forces to fight the Americans near San Antonio in 1836. This bloody battle will end in an American defeat, but the American Texans refuse to surrender. You all know this as the Battle of the Alamo. This will definitely be a key term on your exam. Now, the Alamo, the question again, being a northerner who doesn't know too much about Texas's history before I moved down here, one of the key questions I always had is, why is the Alamo so important if the Americans lost? And there's a twofold answer to this question. Number one, Santa Anna gives no quarter to the Texans who are fighting for independence. Essentially what he does is he slaughters everybody down to the last man. This is an example for other Americans, people living in Mississippi, in Florida, in Georgia. They're saying those guys were brave. They fought till the end. They never gave up the fight. And it inspires more Americans, even Americans as far north as New York or Rhode Island. They say, we're inspired by this, and what Santa Anna did was wrong. And so they start sending guns, people, ammunition, money, supplies, everything you need to put up a resistance, an independence movement, a war. They start sending it down in huge numbers, inspired by the guys who died at the Alamo. Secondly, the defeat at the Alamo for the Americans makes Santa Anna kind of cocky. He gets very arrogant. He says, I've got this uprising covered. And the problem for Santa Anna is he's not just dealing with the Texas Revolution. He's dealing with a revolution down in the Yucatan Peninsula. He's dealing with a revolution out on the Pacific coast. Everyone in Mexico is fighting against Santa Anna. So he gets arrogant, thinks, I've got the Americans taken care of. Don't worry about them. He splits up his forces. When he does this, he doesn't realize the Americans have been resupplied and remanned. And General Sam Houston, the namesake of our city here today, is going to rout Santa Anna's forces at San Jacinto in 1836. This is going to force Santa Anna to accept Texas independence. And so Texas will form an independent republic after this defeat in recognition of their independence from General Santa Anna. Now, at that point, America immediately starts talking about, well, now what do? We've got this new place called Texas. It's got a bunch of Americans in it. There are people. Should we take Texas and make it a state, or should we leave it alone? And again, the issue comes back to slavery. Are you for slavery or are you against slavery? If you're in favor of slavery, you want Texas to become a state. If you're against slavery, you do not want Texas to become a state, because it will become a de facto slave state. Everyone knows it. No one's taking Texas's slaves away. And so this is the major problem. And America starts debating it in 1836. The issue will get tabled in 1837 because America goes through an economic downturn, and the people in the United States essentially aren't too concerned about whether or not we annex Texas as a new state, or if we're just going to leave it alone and let it be an independent republic. So during that time, Texas is going to be basically independent, and that's why they call it an independent nation or a republic. They're independent between 1836 and 1845. This is when you have a new party starting to come out. You have the Whig Party and the Democratic parties are the two major dominant political parties in the United States, and they split regionally on the issue of annexation for Texas. So you have the Liberty Party will start to come about during this time. This is one of the first anti-slavery parties that we see emerging during this time period. They're going to cost Henry Clay some crucial votes in the 1845 election. Martin Van Buren is far too abolitionist to gain any Southern support. And so because of this, we're going to have the candidate who comes out on top is a Democrat by the name of James K. Polk. What he's really all about is he says slavery, no slavery, doesn't really matter. What America needs to focus on is expansion. We need to grow, we need to move west. That's his whole message to the country. Because it's a message that unifies people, it paves his way into the White House, and he wins the election of 1844. When he takes office in 1845, he immediately, as his first act, will annex Texas as a slave state. And so that's how Texas is going to be rolled into the United States and become a state within the larger union. And that's how they're going to maintain their identity as a slave state. All right, that wraps up this lecture right here. We'll pick it up with the next sort of issues dealing with westward expansion in the next mini lecture video. All right, so picking up where we left off, we would last talked about James K. Polk and his expansionist agenda and how he became president and immediately had annexed Texas in 1845. But Polk is not going to stop there when it comes to westward expansion. This is really the hallmark of his presidential campaign and of his presidency. And to understand who James K. Polk was, as I mentioned, he's a Democrat that is largely labeled as pro-slavery and anti-Native American. In fact, John Quincy Adams, an earlier statesman from the United States, a president of the United States, had described James K. Polk as a slave-holding exterminator of Indians. And that was really all he had to say about him. And so, Polk is really obviously one of the things that he's trying to do as part of this push to continue expanding America is get any other obstacles out of the way. And so in 1846, he is now eyeing a possibility of war with Mexico, an issue that we'll be dealing with immediately after this. But what Polk wants to do is there's still this disputed boundary up in the Pacific Northwest and what we've been talking about as Oregon Territory. Oregon Territory was a jointly held possession between the British and the United States. They had disputed where their boundary lines started and ended. And so he wants to make sure this issue is settled before he ends up going to war with Mexico, something that, as we'll see, he views this as an absolute inevitability. And so Polk is going to, in 1846, take advantage of the fact that American settlers have been steadily pouring in over the last 3 decades, flooding into Oregon Territory. And Americans in this region have now drastically come to outnumber British subjects in the region. So with this war on the horizon, the United States is going to send emissaries to England. They're going to send an envoy there to start discussing the cession of Oregon Territory. And what he's able to do is figure out the now extant boundary lines of what is Canada and the United States. And so he's going to be able to do this peacefully. He doesn't have to go to war. But what he's going to do is basically say to England, you can have the area north of this boundary line, we will get the area south. And so the cession of Oregon country or Oregon Territory in 1846, in a lot of ways, it's just Polk trying to get sort of an easy issue of westward expansion out of the way before he deals with a much more contentious issue, which is how America is going to seize the American Southwest. And so he gets the British to agree to the boundary lines, and when you look at a modern-day map of the United States, the line that Polk is able to work out with the British is the present boundary in the Pacific Northwest between California, Oregon, Washington State, that whole region, and what is now Canada. And so he's able to wrap this up pretty quickly, and that boundary line exists right up until today. And if you're, again, following along with me in the slideshow, you'll see on slide 22 we have a map that shows the area that the United States is going to be able to grab up as part of the cession of Oregon country or Oregon territory. And you can also see that line up there that sort of separates the United States from Canada. So that brings us to the much bigger issue moving through our slideshow, the Mexican-American War. This is a conflict that will rage on between 1846 and 1848. And essentially, it's motivated by these unclear boundary lines in the South. When Texas gains its independence, the United States and Mexico are disputing where the United States and Texas begins and ends, and Mexico begins and ends. And so there are vague, unclear boundary lines, and Polk wants to try to settle this. What he does is he sends an ambassador down to Mexico, a guy by the name of John Slidell. And Slidell is going down there ostensibly to deal with these boundary disputes and to collect some unpaid debts that Mexico owes to the United States. Slidell goes down and he's given the instructions from Polk. These negotiations are never supposed to actually yield a fruitful solution for both sides. They're not really negotiations. Slidell goes down with an incredibly aggressive stance to Mexico, and he says, look, here's what's going to happen. You're going to accept our boundary lines for Texas, and that's just that. You're going to pay us the outstanding debts that you owe us. We're finished with that issue. In addition, you're also going to give us New Mexico and Southern California. Now, he knows, Polk knows this, Slidell knows this. Mexico's not giving up any more land. They're still very, very angry about Texas, the Texas Revolution, and Texas independence. They don't want to give up any more land in that territory. So, understandably, those negotiations are going to fail. There's really nothing positive that's going to be able to come out of that with the stance that Slidell takes. So, with their boundary lines unsettled, with the debts unpaid, Mexico and America go to war in 1846. And this is something that Polk really wanted. Polk knew that Mexico is kind of in disarray. Their early government has not really been able to get a solid footing. They've had military dictatorships since Santa Anna came in. And also, they're fighting a number of rebellions in their own country, so they can't devote a lot of resources to fighting the United States. And this is ultimately why Polk is so eager to go to war. He sees this as an easy victory and an easy way to pick up land in the American Southwest. So, when we look at how America responds to this declaration of war, they split pretty much along regional lines, and it again ties back into slavery. Southerners strongly support the war with Mexico. They're going to be in favor of this, and Northerners are saying basically, to continue to fight with Mexico down in the South, we're basically just fighting to try to expand slave territory out to the coast. And so that is really the way that the nation isn't fully in support of this war, but Congress will vote in favor of going to war with Mexico, and there will be 2 years of fighting. And the fighting is largely kind of tit-for-tat skirmishes, right along the borders of New Mexico, modern-day New Mexico and Mexico, out in the Pacific Ocean. There's a lot of naval warfare going on here. And the Americans have a clear advantage in naval warfare because Mexico is yet to develop a very powerful or efficient navy. And so, after 2 years of really kind of standstill fighting, not a lot of territory has been gained or lost on either side, the United States will launch an amphibious assault into Veracruz. Now, they will lose this battle in Veracruz. They fail to take the city, but what they do is they land enough soldiers there to basically skirt Veracruz, move around it. And when they move around Veracruz, they start marching directly towards the capital of Mexico, Mexico City. And when they get to Mexico City, they are able to capture the capital. With this being the case, Mexico realizes this is a lost fight. They cannot keep up this war with America. They don't even have their capital under their possession anymore. And so the victory here in Mexico City is going to force the Mexican government to accept the conditions of American victory, and they are going to sign something known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that's happening in 1848. This treaty is critically important. It ends the Mexican-American War, it recognizes the American victory, but it also is going to cede New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Southern California, as well as an extended part of Texas. Texas gets a little bit bigger as a result of this war, and it gives that all right over to the United States. And so this will allow the United States to continue that push towards westward expansion, keep moving towards the coast. And so really what we're looking at is now the whole of the what we call the continental United States today is owned politically by the U.S. on paper. It's theirs. And so that is really going to allow for a more rapid development and expansion, really moving more populations into these areas in the latter half of the 19th century. So if you're following along with me in the slideshow on slide 26, you can see a copy of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ceding that territory over to the United States. And when we look on slide 27, that's showing you in the orange section there where it says 1848. That's showing you that all of the territory that Mexico is being forced to give up to the U.S. And so Texas now, as you can see, doesn't look exactly like where we're living today. They're a little bit bigger back at this time, everything they call Texas territory. And the Mexican cession area, what's being given over to the United States, that is the orange section that you're seeing on that map. So again, another huge part of what today we call the U.S. is given to the U.S. by Mexico after the Mexican-American War. So we have most of the country now under American control, and that issue of slavery pops up once again. The Whig Party had already split over the issue of expanding slavery westward. They're falling apart. They're crumbling. The Democratic Party is starting to fall apart as well. You still have Northern Democrats who are anti-slavery and Southern Democrats who are pro-slavery. Now, these schisms are ultimately going to start to create room for what are known as free soil parties. In 1848, we start to see them emerge. They are all in favor of complete and total abolition of slavery in the United States. These are really the precursors of our modern-day Republican Party. As I've mentioned in class prior to this, the origins of the Republican Party rest in a push to end slavery in the United States. But now we have all this new territory, and Americans have to come to some sort of consensus on how slavery is going to operate there, if it will operate at all. And a Pennsylvanian congressman, a Democrat from Pennsylvania by the name of David Wilmot, will introduce what we call the Wilmot Proviso in 1848. This bill stated that slavery could not expand into those recently acquired territories that were picked up after the Mexican-American War. In other words, what's happening here is whatever Mexico ceded to the U.S. as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is off limits for slavery. Now, this is ultimately going to be seen as an attack by the Southerners. They see this as an attack on their peculiar institution. And so there is a lot of anger over the Wilmot Proviso. It's going to squeak through in Congress, but ultimately there's going to be a lot of opposition to this. The president, James K. Polk, steps up and says, I don't think the Wilmot Proviso is fair. Really what we should do is just continue extending that line of the Missouri Compromise that was established in the 1820s. It's an imaginary line that splits the United States in half, and it says anything south of the line is slave territory, anything north is free territory. So Polk says, let's just take that line all the way out to the Pacific coast and let it deal, and we'll have it that way. This doesn't work for Northerners because now all that territory that was just acquired from Mexico has become open to slavery. So that is when a senator from Michigan, Lewis Cass, will introduce the idea of popular sovereignty. And this will become the mechanism by which people decide on slavery moving forward. The idea of popular sovereignty says settlers should move into the territory and then vote whether or not they want slavery. It's a really simple concept. It's kind of democracy in action. But there is an issue here. Cass doesn't specify when you vote for slavery. He doesn't say it's as soon as you have X number of settlers. He doesn't say it's once you've drafted a state constitution. So there's no clarity on when this vote is supposed to take place. Now, as far as the Southerners are concerned, they think it should be when you've drafted a state constitution, then the people in the territory vote on slavery. Northerners think it should occur once a state legislature is established, something that would be happening earlier. And you can see the thought processes here. What the South wants to do is flood a bunch of people and their slaves in, give them time to settle in the territory, and then you're taking slavery away from people. You're not just saying it's illegal in the first place. Those are two very different things you're trying to do. And so Northerners want to vote earlier because they want to stop slavery before it enters into these territories. Now, this becomes really one of the most contentious issues. Now, slavery and westward expansion is firmly the hot button issue of the mid 19th century in America. All of this issue over slavery is going to allow Zachary Taylor, a Mexican American war hero, to become the final Whig president in the United States. And he's running for president in 1848. Largely what he's going to do is he's going to say, we need unity over partisanship. I'm not here to try and negotiate the issue of slavery. I am trying to lead the country forward one way or the other. And he basically runs a sort of two-faced campaign, something we're kind of a lot more familiar with in modern times. He's one of the first presidential candidates to run two different campaigns. When he goes down in the South, he says, look, I'm a slave owner. You know what I'm going to do. You know who I'm going to look out for. But then when he goes and he campaigns up north, he says, look, I'm not going to use my veto power to get rid of legitimate laws that were passed by Congress, laws like the Wilmot Proviso. So he's basically convincing the South, yes, I'm going to expand slavery westward, and he's convincing the North, I'm not going to get involved. I have nothing to do with slavery. I'm just the president. I execute the laws. I don't make the laws. And so because of this, he has a very smooth run into the White House and will become the next president. Martin Van Buren, who is really becoming a prominent figure of the Abolitionist Party, he is going to really hurt the Democrats. He's going to draw a lot of anti-slavery Democrats away from that party by running as a free soil candidate. Now, as we know, he's not going to win, but they are trying to eliminate slavery from every inch of American soil, and this is going to badly hurt the Democrats' chances of actually winning the election. So that's what's kind of catapulting Taylor into the White House. So that wraps up our discussion on actual territorial gains, how America comes to acquire all this area on paper. The last issue I want to deal with for this week's lectures is the California Gold Rush. And what we're looking at here is rapid expansion in the 1840s and the early 1850s. The gold rush really begins in earnest in 1848. But by the time this gold rush comes to an end, you have so many 49ers, as they call them. It's really the bulk of the gold rush. That name is suggesting something. There's a reason that the San Francisco 49ers are called the San Francisco 49ers. It's because the vast majority of migrants moving to California in search of gold are moving during the year 1849. You can see how creative that is. But the issue here is that so many people are going to move into California between 1848 and 1850 that by 1850, California is going to be able to apply for statehood, and they are going to enter into the Union as a free state at their own will. But to kind of look at the story of the gold rush, it begins in January of 1848. It's when a guy named John W. Marshall, who's living in Northern California, just outside of modern-day San Francisco, he discovers some gold nuggets in a stream on a property called Sutter's Mill. Marshall would then take his gold to a local shopkeeper in the big city of San Francisco. This shopkeeper then starts basically retooling his business. He starts putting mining goods in his store. He starts selling things you would need to find gold. Then he runs out into the streets with a big jar of gold dust and starts yelling, "There's gold everywhere, there's gold everywhere. Everyone needs to come to California and find gold." Pretty soon local newspapers start picking up on this, and the word starts to spread back east. And everyone now is under this belief that California is absolutely replete with gold. You can't swing an axe anywhere without hitting gold. And so, once news hits the East Coast, it spreads from there around the rest of the world. The vast majority of migrants that are going to start to put this gold rush into motion are coming from the eastern United States. They're coming from what today we call the Midwest and sort of the Northeast. And even the American Southeast. But You're also seeing people come from Australia, South Africa. You have people coming from mainland Europe, people coming from Latin America. Another massive migrant group that moves over to the United States during this time are the Chinese. So they're going to start migrating and moving by boat through the Pacific, coming into California. In fact, the name for California, and I can't remember whether it's Cantonese or Mandarin, one of the two dialects of Chinese. What you're looking at is that the name of California up until this day means mountain of gold in their language. It shows you how pervasive this idea is. Now, when gold is initially discovered in California, it is a sparsely populated area. There's very few people there. But by 1850, over 2 years, 50,000 people will move in, most of them coming from the eastern U.S., but really people from all over the globe start pouring into California. What that does is it allows it to apply for statehood in that same year, in 1850. And so you can see how rapid this expansion was in California. And people are moving out there. It's important to understand the mindset. A lot of people are going to move out there, look their whole lives, never find gold, and die poor. But the reality is that this is an opportunity that you can't find anywhere else. You can stay on your farm in the Midwest and work until you die, basically, and you'll just barely be able to make ends meet. With one swing of a pickaxe in California, you can be rich beyond your wildest dreams. And so this type of economic opportunity, this is what's pulling people in, but it's a big gamble. People are basically putting their lives on the line to try and move into California. As I mentioned, if you're following along with the slides, on slide 33, we have to start talking about all of the different types of people that are moving into California. They're coming from all over the globe, and there's a large number of Chinese migrants moving in. They're really the most notable, most visible migrant class coming from outside the United States during the gold rush. But you also have Spanish speakers who are living there since it belonged to Mexico, and even before that when it belonged to Spain. They initially are working with the Americans to start setting up a form of government. There's a lot of cohesion between the Spanish speakers and the English speaking Americans that move out there. But once the competition becomes fierce for gold in this territory, those Spanish speakers are dispossessed of their lands. They're basically being driven out of the way by the people pouring into California. Chinese migrants start to come in huge numbers, and they create a lot of resentment amongst the American gold prospectors. The Chinese are given the worst tracts of land, places where you think there's absolutely no gold, they're never going to make any money here. Somehow, they still manage to turn a profit. They're very, very successful in their mining endeavors. And so this creates that sort of economic tension between them and the American prospectors. And then all of a sudden, you start to see the creation of nativist laws. It bars Chinese migrants from working in the mining industry altogether. So they start to do other things. They open up restaurants. They open up hotels. They start engaging in other businesses. A lot of them will go and start building the railway and building out the railway system in that part of the nation. So they're going to be denied any claims to the areas where gold is actively being found, and they're constantly the target of American anger. Their mining camps are burned down. They're being violently attacked in the streets of San Francisco, and they're a very visible migrant group. They're very, very much, they have a lot of national pride, which makes, when they do communicate with Americans, they don't come off as necessarily happy to be in the United States or willing to adapt to American culture. They wear their hair differently. They wear their clothes differently. They speak, obviously, very different language. And so it makes them very visible targets, and there's a lot of hatred sent towards the Chinese during this time period. Then finally, you have Native Americans, and they're going to fare the worst out of any group out there. They are dying in huge numbers due to the rapid spread of disease. They're constantly in combat with American settlers. They're getting killed off in warfare. And all of this prospecting, grabbing up land, building new businesses, growing cities, it's pushing them out of the land that they needed to hunt and find resources. So they die from starvation as well. Today we refer to this as the California Genocide. But really, this is just the tail end of the California Genocide. This process actually begins back in the 1760s when Spain was still forcing Native Americans into missions and forcing them into these colonial enterprises where they were dying. But between 1848 and 1870, the population of Native Americans in California drops from 150,000 down to 30,000. So you can see that the vast majority of Native Americans are dying during this time period of the gold rush. So while it's a time of great prosperity for a lot of Americans, they've achieved finally this goal of manifest destiny. They've spread from coast to coast. Again, it's coming at the expense of the people who are already in those territories. So the gold rush is generally regarded as having ended in 1855, and we can still see some remnants of this in the American landscape. Mining is an incredibly boom bust industry. Somebody finds gold, everybody pours into that one area, they dig, 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 and when there's no gold left, everybody leaves. But what you're seeing is it's mostly men traveling out there looking for gold, but women would come out west to try their hand in trade as well. They would often work as domestic servants. They would work, a lot of times would get out there and find themselves making a good living with prostitution because you have a lot of single men out there looking for gold. But there are a lot of women who are actually great entrepreneurs, and they're able to get out there and start making huge fortunes for themselves. They're setting up hotels, they're setting up restaurants. These guys who are moving out, they need somewhere to stay, they need somewhere to eat. And women are taking care of these needs, these economic niches within the overall economic structure of California during the gold rush. And they're finding a lot more economic freedom than they might back east, out here in the West. So, gambling and drinking become frequent problems out in the American West because there's a lot of desperation. As I said, everyone thinks that with one swing of the axe, I'm going to get rich. This is going to be it. But for a lot of people, it never happens. And so they spend whatever little money they do make drinking, gambling, and losing their money. In addition to this process, this is where we see the emergence of a number of ghost towns out in the West. And this is the remnant of the gold rush. You have everybody flooding into a little town, and all of a sudden there's a restaurant, there's 4 hotels, there's 3 more restaurants, there's now we need a sheriff and a sheriff's office. You see an entire economy builds around these gold mines, but then when the gold goes dry, they leave a ghost town behind. Everyone leaves, the buildings are still there, the structures are still there, but the people are not. And so the gold rush is going to largely deplete a lot of the mineral resources in California. Even though everyone was saying there's enough gold to go around forever in California, that's not really the case. They're going to go in, and that gold rush it basically clears Northern California of gold. And so by 1855, that whole process will come to an end. And as you go through the rest of the slides, you'll see some of the images of the different groups we've been talking about, sort of showing you these ghost towns, what mining life might have looked like. You can see some disturbing images from the California genocide. But to just wrap up this entire lecture for this week, I want you to take a look at the map on slide 38. When we look at where we started talking this week, you're seeing the Louisiana Purchase territory in that sort of pale tannish color in the middle. Down, we see Texas annexation in yellow. And we see the Mexican cession in orange and the cession of Oregon country in green. And so when you look at all of that together, when you see everything that's going on there, you will realize that by the time the gold rush hits in the 1850s, America is looking at that concept of manifest destiny we talked about at the beginning of this lecture, and they're saying, mission accomplished. It's done. We have expanded from coast to coast. And as you can see from the map there, the modern day continental United States with a few minor areas like the borders of Minnesota and sort of, I guess that would be North Dakota out there. That area, we're going to get that ceded by Great Britain. The Gadsden Purchase in 1853 adds a little bit on to the American Southwest. But for the most part, this area is now established. The United States as a continental entity has been completed. And manifest destiny to the people living during this time period looks like it has come to fruition. Well, I appreciate you tuning in for this week. Again, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, Feel free to shoot me an email at davyj@uhd.edu. And if you would like to speak face to face, kind of set up some remote office hours, face to face, we'll put in quotes, feel free to let me know and we can set up a Zoom session. So take care, everybody. I hope you're all doing well.